Say hello and welcome to everyone to the webinar, How to Turn Researchers into Research Managers, with Robert Dingwall, co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Research Management. My name is Michael Todd, and I'm the Community Manager of MethodSpace. Let me begin by introducing you to our speaker. Robert Dingwall is the co-editor, as I said, in the Sage Handbook of Research Management. He's a consulting sociologist providing research and advisory services, particularly in relation to organizational strategy, public engagement, and knowledge transfer. He's a part-time professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nottingham Trent University, and his career has been spent in research in areas such as healthcare, law, science, and technology studies, work which is reflected in more than 100 peer-reviewed papers and numerous books, reports, and book chapters. Much of this work has crossed traditional disciplinary boundaries, involving collaboration with health professionals, lawyers, engineers, and scholars. Robert, who also blogs for MethodSpace's sister site, Social Science Space, has a long-standing interest in social research ethics. And by the way, as a special benefit for webinar registrants, we're offering a 50% discount code. It's going to be UK16HDBKS. I'll repeat that again at the end. It's on the screen right now, for those who would like to purchase the Handbook of Research Management. And again, if you didn't catch that code, don't worry. We'll repeat it on a slide at the end of the webinar. This 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. Also, if any of you have any problems with audio or video viewing during a webinar, and we know that that is possible, those of you that worked with us last time, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any question of the speaker throughout the webinar. And please take note of the webinar hashtag, and that's hashtag MethodSpace, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Robert. Thank you.
Oh, hello everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction, Michael. I should apologize if the sound quality isn't all that it might be, but I'm afraid my broadband went offline this afternoon, and I think, as Michael said, it's just one of these events that seems to be a bit cursed. Anyway, let's start by just running briefly over some of the background to this seminar, talking about the Sage Handbook of Research Management, and who's behind it, why we did it, some indication of what we think it might be used for, and some of the key messages that we've extracted from it. And that'll just give us time to warm up and for you to get some questions going, which Mike will then relay to me, because I don't have a functioning screen here, so I can't see what questions are coming in. So if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, we're going to run through the slides. You should now be seeing one which says, who are the editors, or something like that. And as you've heard, one of them is me, Robert Dingwall. I'm drawing on 20 years of career experience working in research institutes, which is a slightly unusual length of time to be doing that for a conventional academic. I did my PhD in a research institute specializing in medical sociology, public health, health policy, worked through most of the 1980s in a research institute focused on the sociology of law. For 12 years or so, I then directed an institute in science and technology studies. In between that while, I spent 5 years as a department chair, and I've sort of knocked around the higher education system in the UK and to some extent in the US in various other capacities. And my co-editor, Mary Byrne McDonald, is the executive director of the Social Science Research Council in New York. She started out as a historian and then as a journalist, working mainly in Asia and the Middle East. And in her present role, she has a lot of engagement with developing and supporting international research collaborations. So if we can have the next slide, please. You should now be seeing a slide which says, why did we compile this book? And what we're looking at here is three things which had struck both Mary and myself, that we weren't very happy with the nature of the university management that we were witnessing, It seemed, a lot of it seemed to rest on very old-fashioned kinds of ideas about command and control. It wasn't really plugged into the best thinking in contemporary management schools about how to run innovative organizations, about the nature of effective leadership, about team building, and so on. I mean, it's something of a paradox. You know, every major university, you know, likes to brag about its business school, but the output of the business school is largely ignored by the university management. You know, I remember once talking to a very distinguished professor of strategy about the way his university went about doing its strategic planning. He did say that if he was brave enough, he would have used it as an MBA case study in how not to do this. We've observed quite a lot of poor practice between us. What we've come to recognize is that being a great researcher and getting lots of grant money doesn't necessarily make you a great manager. I've done sort of field work in laboratories, and you can see that in lab science, you know, PIs vary between those who are really very supportive and mentoring and encouraging of their research students and postdocs, and those who think that leadership is just coming in the morning and shouting at people, chosen largely at random. And you know, if you randomly shout at people often enough, then you know, things will happen. And I suppose the concern of colleagues that we talk to, you know, that there's a lot of ad hoc experience out there, but there's not a great deal in the way of systematic resources that would support professional development. So we designed this book, and if we can have the next slide, who is this book for? Well, what we're recognizing is that there's increasingly people are taking up roles as leaders of research teams, centers or institutes. And that applies whether you're in science, technology, engineering, medicine, or whether you're in social science and humanities. There's quite a trend to, I think, perhaps a greater separation between teaching and research roles in universities, towards the concentration of research in larger units, which present a different kind of management challenge to the individual PI and, you know, a couple of graduate students and you know, maybe an associated research fellow that might have been the case, particularly in social sciences and humanities until quite recently. But we think that the book will also be useful to graduate students who are thinking long-term about their research careers. I mean, you know, we don't expect everybody to read every chapter on day one, but we think there's material in there that perhaps helps somebody who is now doing a PhD or coming to the end of a PhD and thinking about their futures, about the skills and experiences that they might want to acquire so that they can one day run their own research group. And we also think it should be read, although we're not entirely confident it will be, by research managers at really quite a senior level. In Britain we would talk about pro-vice chancellors for research. In the States you might talk about vice presidents. Elsewhere you might talk about vice rectors. People in the senior management teams of universities who are trying to think about research support, who are trying to think about how to design more effective organizations for encouraging and developing high quality research in their institutions. So if we have the next slide, this should be one that describes the structure of the book. And the book itself, for those of you who haven't yet seen it, is divided into 8 sections, each of which contains 3 or 4 chapters. Each section has an editorial introduction, and so we've really designed it so that it could be used either as a reference work. You know, you can have it sitting on your shelf and you can pull it down when there's a crisis and see if there's anything helpful there, and we hope you will find something. Or you can use it as the basis for a professional development program. You might take a section, let's say 1 section every month, in an interdisciplinary workshop for future research leaders within a university, or you know, within a professional network. So we think there's an opportunity here for to be used as a learning resource as well as a reference work. So what are our key messages? And this is the next slide. Well, we think that there's two things that we want everybody to take away from the book. The first is that management is really essential to modern universities. Academics have this kind of cultural resistance to taking management seriously, and then the result is that this is partly why it often doesn't get done very well. We all have this obsession with some imagined past when we enjoyed all this sort of free resources, free inquiry and so on. Actually, as we show, when you look at the history of universities, there's never been a time when academics have just been given lots of money and told to go away and spend it. They've never been left alone to get on with things. But this kind of nostalgia for some kind of imagined golden age, rather gets in the way of us saying, well, management is a serious business. We ought to be good at it. We ought to find out how to do it. We ought to recognize that there's actually an evidence base for doing it out there. The second is that universities operate today, as they always have, in a very complex and uncertain environment. There's an awful lot of stakeholders in the university. What it's producing is very diverse. The workforce is diverse. These are things that need to be juggled. They need to be reconciled. And that's a very considerable challenge. I mean, it's as big an intellectual challenge to anybody doing it as doing high-quality research or high-quality teaching, and we ought to respect that and to respond to it. So what kinds of organisation do we think ought to be created? And this is the next slide. Well, one of the things that we recognise from the literature is that universities have to be what the organisational theorists call ambidextrous. You need a stable element which is about teaching, and you need an entrepreneurial element for research. And it's actually quite hard to get both of those things happening in one organisation, and it's really quite hard to have a workforce that's trying to do both of those at once. And that's something that I think we haven't been very good at recognising. We also know from the work of people like Henry Mintzberg that a typical response to the uncertainty and instability is to try to create more internal stability, and that means on the whole creating more internal bureaucracies, more internal controls, more internal regulation, trying to sort of get a tighter management control over all these messy entrepreneurs. On the other hand, we also know from the literature that successful innovative organizations in the private sector are actually flatter and more decentralized, and are increasingly so. That the local business units, that's I suppose the equivalent of a university department or a research institute, tend to know their markets much better than the central management or central directorates. And it's a tricky business if a university just depends for its entire strategy and development on the half a dozen men, and they're almost always men, who gather in the president's office or the vice chancellor's office or the rector's office on a Monday morning, to take the big decisions. And so at least some of the things that we say in the book are about, as a research group director, as a research group leader, an institute director, is how you negotiate that relationship. That you will almost certainly know your market better than anybody else, but you won't necessarily have have that built into the systems of the internal management systems of the institution. So on the next slide, we talk about some of the skills that people need to develop to be effective leaders of research groups, institutes, centers, whatever. They need to be an entrepreneur, somebody who is flexible, somebody who's innovative, somebody who is out there engaged with the external world, looking for the opportunities to develop the team and, where necessary, to take the team in the new directions. And that involves being a successful networker, somebody who is very much engaged with a professional community, with a policy community, with building external constituencies of support for the work, somebody who is collaborative, somebody who can work with other members of the team, can work where appropriate across fields, work in collaboration with other research groups where appropriate. Somebody who's a mentor, somebody who cares very much about the professional development of the early career graduate students, postdocs, junior academics who might be working on their team, and finally somebody who is good at multitasking, and somebody who can still hopefully cut it in the research field, but somebody who can also do the communications, somebody who can do the strategy, somebody who can oversee the budget, somebody who can engage in the institutional politics that are generally necessary for the survival of the group. And we think this can be expressed in three particular commitments, and this is the last slide but one. Firstly, in respect for people, we think one of the greatest qualities of any leader is actually humility. It's not seeking to take the credit for everything. It's not assuming that you know best in all respects. It's about listening to the ideas that come out of the team. It's about creating an environment in which people are free to come forward with innovative ideas and to understand that they're going to get credit for it. A commitment to integrity in research and organizational life, and that really means a zero tolerance for disruptive behavior, the sorts of things that we've been reading about in some of the professional magazines in the last year or so about sexual harassment, racial harassment, abusive behavior by senior figures in many academic fields. I mean, this is just sort of utterly incompatible with any kind of high-quality leadership. Leaders do not exploit that position, and they don't tolerate it within their teams. And the third is really a recognition of a responsibility to society that makes the team's work possible at all. In the UK we talk a lot about impact, which is really a much sort of narrower version of this kind of commitment. Most of us depend to a greater or lesser extent on public funds to support research, or on philanthropic funds that have been raised by charities, funds that have been donated by wealthy individuals for public purposes, where they've chosen to make them available for research rather than for example, for direct service provision. Overall, you do need to remember that we academics may not think that we're terribly well paid, but actually our salaries are paid by people who make a lot less than we do. They're either being paid through their taxation, through their donations, through, if you like, foregoing the benefits of a service foundation for a research foundation. And that, I think, is something that leaders need to keep constantly in mind, and to keep constantly in front of their team. We're doing this for someone. We're doing this for some greater purpose. We're not just doing this for ourselves. Now, there's a few ideas that I've thrown out. We come to the last slide, just in case you've forgotten who I am and what I'm talking about. And I hope in the time that I've been talking, there's been an opportunity to develop some questions and some dialogue. And so I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to hand this back to Michael, who is going to facilitate the interaction. Since I can't see any of your questions coming in, Michael will relay them to me, and I'll do my best to deal with them as they come through. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you. Michael.
Thank you, Robert. And I have definitely not forgotten who you are. I'm going to turn to the audience now. We're going to they have. I'm going to abuse my role or take advantage of my role as moderator to ask the first question or two. In particular, because I have one that I don't think is going to come from the audience, but make sure that the audience continues to send us questions using the question box on the right side of their screen, or of your screen, or on Twitter using the hashtag #MethodSpace. And by the way, if we can't get to your question by the end of the hour, Robert has agreed to address them in follow-up blog post that will appear on MethodSpace and also on Social Science Space. But Robert, my first question is going to completely step on the premise of the webinar, which is how to turn research. And given the difficulties and the skills that have to be developed by someone that might be a raging individualist on their own, why not just bring in a professional manager to take care of this and get on with your research?
Well, I think that professional management can actually be extremely helpful. I mean, I've been very lucky in my career to work with some very good department managers who have given me a great deal of support, and a rather smaller number of people from central administrative functions like HR and finance. But at the end of the day, you really need an understanding of the business of research in order to manage it effectively. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you necessarily need to be, absolutely on the front line of where a field is going. I mean, I've known some quite successful scientists, for example, who've more or less withdrawn from active lab work, but they can keep up enough to understand the challenges and the difficulties, and the sort of what it actually takes to spend 18 hours in the lab running an experiment, because that's what the experiment requires. And I think if you don't have some sense of that, it's actually much more difficult to deal with the staff. I would also actually say, as an experienced manager, I don't want too many raging individualists on my team, because they're a pain in the ass. And if you are going to be a raging individualist, for your entire career, you're probably not going to have much of a career. Your contemporary research is about your ability to work with other people, and if you're not very good at that, then maybe this isn't the long-term career that you should be embarking on.
So let's say then that I am interested in this. Do I wait for the serendipitous tap on the shoulder to say, yes, I choose you to move up to the ranks of a research manager, or should I volunteer, or how do I prepare myself if it's something that I'm interested in, or if I'm not the raging individualist and I want to be the collaborationist? What should I do to make that happen?
Well, and it's about, I mean, one of the things that we do address in the book is about, if you like, that sort of progression from, here's your first grant, and you have the challenge, as I suggested, of a couple of PhD students and maybe a research fellow, and this is what I'm trying to do with it. And if you find you like it and you're good at it, you will tend to want to get bigger grants and assemble bigger teams, and at some point you will want to give that some sort of institutional recognition, some sort of institutional foundation, something that gives it a more kind of secure brand, a more secure basis for development. But frankly, sometimes it's also the tap on the shoulder. When I created the Institute for Science and Technology Studies that I ran for 12 years, it was quite literally a university president coming to me and saying, I want a research group that does this. Will you do it? And I had no record in that previous field. As I said, I'd worked on studies of medicine, I'd worked on studies of law. His view was, well, if you've done that, you can do this. and we started off from there. So but you could say, well, yeah, that is trading in 20 years capital of working research of working as a research fellow on all the kind of sort of short-term contracts and stuff that research institutes tend to evolve. And then sort of it being recognized that the qualities of entrepreneurship and leadership are there, and there is a strategic interest in the university in having something happen, and you're the guy to do it. So if you like, the book is about encouraging that, is a resource for encouraging that kind of reflection and self-development of both in terms of supporting your own ambitions, but also in terms of being seen as the sort of person with the right sort of skills when an opportunity knocks. Michael.
In that regard, one of the things that you mentioned was that so many of the managers are male, and I'm wondering if you and I are both male, but I'm wondering if you could nonetheless kind of address some of the things that if I were female and I were trying to do this, what would be some of the specific obstacles that I might meet, and then what would be some strategies that I might use to overcome those?
Well, I think I'm not sure that there are special issues for women here that are distinct from the general challenges for women in building academic careers. In my experience, I've seen some and worked with some very successful women managers, and sometimes I think that, but I would say, if you like, the sort of distribution, there's a bit of a fantasy about sort of women. Women academics are intrinsically more nurturing, and I think a lot of them complain about being sort of, so to some extent sidelined into those roles. I've actually also known women who are just as egocentric as and individualists as the scholars that you were caricaturing a few moments ago. So I'm not sure. I think there are special issues about the to some extent the kind of trailing partner existence that some women scholars still find themselves stuck with in the system. That can be a difficulty in developing the kinds of secure and continuing networks in a particular institution that's help them to to build a reputation and for competence and to get established. Clearly, for where there are issues about parental responsibility and career breaks and for childbearing and so on, those can kind of interrupt the trajectory. And I think it's fair to say in my own generation, with people who entered into university careers in the 1970s, some of the most successful women leaders didn't have children, and it's, I think, a real challenge to the system to find ways of accommodating the very reasonable desire of many women to and men to to both have children and pursue careers of this kind. I think the important thing is, if you like, is this sort of awareness of where a career might go and what it might take to get to where you want to be. And that I'm not entirely convinced is a gendered matter. It's about finding the ways. It's about taking advantage of the opportunities to do the networking. If some structures systematically exclude you, it's drawing attention to that, looking for ways around it, but also not being afraid to challenge it. I can think of one department that I know of which always used to schedule its department seminars at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was then a sort of lobby to say, look, this is not consistent with picking up our kids from school. It excludes a whole bunch of us, actually both men and women in the department, from active participation. And those seminars were rescheduled to start at 1 o'clock. and the teaching sessions were rescheduled around that. So I think some of it is some of it's about the self-development, but some of it's also about being prepared to do a certain amount of pushing, to either to find the workarounds or to insist on being accommodated. And again, I think it's a challenge to perhaps the current generation of managers to think about, how do we deal with this? How do we ensure that we bring on all the talent in our team, rather than just those who happen to fit a model that we grew up with? Michael.
So one of the things that you had focused on in preparing for this webinar is the idea that this is both for STEM and for humanities and social scientists. And I'm wondering, is there a difference in the progression? Is in becoming moving from research manager, does it differ from discipline to discipline, from sociology to medicine to law, etc.?
I think there was a time when it might have done. I think that's sort of less and less the case. I mean, clearly, STEM subjects, STEM disciplines, they're much more used to working with quite large sums of money. That doesn't, there's not necessarily a direct correlation between the size of money and the number of people on the team, because, if you're doing expensive research in an expensive subject, that kind of, the infrastructure sort of swallows up the budget as much as the people. So you may not necessarily be dealing with bigger teams. What I think we've more traditionally had in some social sciences and most of the humanities is much more of a model of individual scholarship. And we're seeing that eroded, I think, to an increasing extent. I think it will always be important, but we're seeing funding streams partly to try to cut down the overheads of the funders. But we're seeing funding streams coming out in bigger chunks, trying to promote interdisciplinary collaborations by funding teams rather than individuals. We're seeing perhaps a more deliberate attempt to establish and develop concentrations of research expertise in social science and humanities. Some of that is linked to the growing use of digital technologies, although not exclusively. So I think that there is a degree of convergence. I think there will always be the individual scholar in the humanities, just as you would find, frankly, in some areas like like mathematics, for example, some areas of theoretical physics, where quite a lot can be done by one person sitting in an office and thinking very hard. But in general, I think we have been seeing this convergence on a rather different organizational model for research in many research-intensive universities. Michael?
Once I've become a research manager, does that mean I'm no longer a researcher? I don't think that's a necessary consequence. I mean, it does happen to some people. Usually as a matter of choice. I mean, people, as I've said, I mean, sometimes, I've known one or two people in the STEM area, for example, who really just find that their fields are moving too fast to be, to be able to sort of keep up with exactly where their postdocs are at. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't continue to ask the right questions, they can't continue to have a sort of general grasp on the direction. I've known one or two anthropologists who frankly felt that they were getting a bit old for sort of going out to remote villages and living in tents, and the sort of physical hardships that go along with
field work. So there is, I think that it is important to have the intellectual respect of your team. That isn't necessarily achieved by being engaged every day in research in quite the same way that they are. But I think if you haven't got that intellectual respect, it's much harder to be their leader. It's about it's about being able to express your understanding and sympathy for what it is that they go through every day. I mean, it's not always completely practical, that you get caught up in the representational role that goes with leading a big research team. Funders expect you to attend meetings. You serve time on university committees. You may get maybe playing a leading role in the learned societies or the professional associations for your discipline. I mean, all of those things are actually very important activities, in terms of sustaining your team's visibility and its position within the community. But ultimately, I think it's important that your team, do have an intellectual respect for you, and that you need to think about how you might be maintaining that if you're, only able to be in a lab, 1 or 2 days a week, or if it's sort of difficult to, to get out and do the field work, or to sit down for, a day at a time with a database and, start running analyses on it. It is, it's part of the sacrifice that people make when they move into these roles. It does constrain the amount of research, but I think it's important not to give it up. Michael?
What would you say are the most common mistakes that you see as a researcher moves into a management position? And then the follow-up to that is, after the mistake, how do you address that?
I think the thing that it took me some time to learn was the importance of not trying to micromanage everything. As a researcher, you do care minutely about everything that you're trying to do on a project, and you have to let some of that go when you move into a management role. You're there to create a climate for your team. You're there to support people. You're there to encourage their professional development. And you don't encourage that by sort of sitting on their shoulders all the time, saying, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. You've got to provide a way for them to grow. Because, I mean, remember, you're responsible for producing your own successors, for producing the next generation. And you can't do that if you're kind of, you're sort of hanging around them all the time, giving them minute direction. I mean, they need to be accountable, and you need to be there to support them. And sometimes you will need to help them recognize that they've made a mistake, and what lessons they should learn from it. But I think giving your team the space to succeed, if you like, it comes back to the point that I was making about the importance of humility in a leader, that allowing you're there to to ensure the survival of the group, the flow of resources to the group, but you're also there to give to create the space for the people in the group to develop themselves, to become PIs and principal investigators in their own right, to be linked to the networks that you're linked to be linked to the funding sources that you're linked to, to grow into that space. And that I think is actually, probably it was a mistake that I sort of made early on, but I would say it was part of my own growth as a manager, was learning from people who were pointing it out to me that I was overcrowding, and I was trying to micromanage, and you have to have enough trust that you're hiring good people. Sometimes they will make mistakes, but if they don't have the space to make mistakes, they also won't have the space to do exciting things. And what matters is that you praise the exciting things and you help them to learn from the mistakes. Michael.
A lot of these things are kind of easy to spot in other people, but when I'm doing it myself, it's kind of hard. How do I know when to delegate, or how do I know when to call in outside expertise? I mean, what would be some of the markers that would, assuming that people aren't coming up to telling me it's like you've taken on too much, how do I know internally that it's time to do that?
Well, I think it is about cultivating an attitude of do I need to do this, or could I delegate it to somebody else for whom it will be an opportunity for their professional development? I have the good fortune at the very beginning of my career to work for an institute director who was very committed to who was actually really very committed to those sorts of ideas about development. I mean, if there was a meeting to discuss a possible interdepartmental collaboration or a new research project or something, and the most appropriate person on his team to send was one of the postdocs, he was quite happy to do that. On one or two occasions, he would even send an advanced PhD student, as you're the person in the team who really knows this stuff. I've spoken to the to the PI, the prospective PI in the other group, and we've agreed that you should represent us. And I don't think it's actually so much a question about can I delegate this as do I need to do it? Does it have to be me? Now there are things where it does have to be you. If there's some budget crisis and you're hauled off to the president's office, you don't send anybody else. If there is I know one department chair, for example, who always tried to get his department manager rather, to break the bad news about, or to try to hold various faculty members to account for their failure to turn up for teaching slots and so on. That was just cowardice, and that's something that I think you absolutely don't do. So yes, there are the things that you can't delegate. But your first question the first question to ask when some opportunity comes up or some new thing comes in is, does it have to be me, Michael?
So obviously the book is your book, the Sage Handbook of Research Management, is a huge resource. But taking that as a given, what are some of the other resources that are out there for someone that's interested in taking this journey?
Well, there are a growing number of other publications, and doing a bit of Googling around, we'll turn them up. In the UK, the universities collectively have been trying to develop more training, to develop a leadership academy. There is a bit more training going on certainly within UK universities I'm familiar with. I've seen less of it, I have to say, in North America, but that may just be because I haven't been in the places where it's happening. I think it's something that is being increasingly recognized by institutions as something they need to do, but they're not quite sure how to do it. And there I think we come back to, if you like, the failure of university managements to really take note of the sort of leading, the best evidence that is coming out of the management schools, out of the business schools, on how this sort of stuff should be done, and to recognise that there is a knowledge base here. There are skills that can be taught and developed. I mean, I would like to see much more systematic training available for, for university managers at all levels. I think it's a problem for department chairs as much as for research institute directors, and it may be that some department chairs would actually find stuff in the handbook that would be helpful to them, even if it wasn't necessarily designed for that purpose. So I think that there is, I think there's a great weakness in many universities about training for leadership, about training for progression in management, because most people who get to be full professors somewhere will be expected to do some of this at some point, and I'd rather they were properly trained and did it well, rather than being sort of pushed into the role and told to get on with it. Michael.
Do you think academia is a little bit weaker than private industry in making sure that prospective managers or mid-level managers are trained or get the resources that they need?
Oh, I think universities are well behind the curve. I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize about the private sector, because clearly there are good companies and there are bad companies, but organizations of the scale of most universities, especially most research-intensive universities, do strike me as having, for the most part, much more sophisticated management development programs. They're looking for talent, they're looking for prospective middle managers from a much earlier stage in people's careers, and the succession planning is a much more conspicuous part of the whole way in which the organization works. I mean, and they have HR departments that are much better geared up to that. I've yet to come across a university HR department that had a really kind of positive approach to career management for academics, and I mean, to some extent, that's the fault of the academics themselves in being very dismissive about, what professional HR people might have to offer. And, we do tend, some of us at least do tend to be a little bit arrogant about, there's only sort of them, there's sort of them over there, and they don't really have much to offer, and we're the smart people in the institution. Well, yes and no. I mean, people have different skill sets, and I don't think we should be too proud to learn from, the sort of sophisticated HR departments that you would find in some private sector organizations.
What about being a mentor or looking for a mentor? Let me break that into two. Should I, if I'm interested in doing this, or even if I started, should I be looking for a mentor? And also, if I'm a fairly senior manager at this point, should I look to be a mentor?
Well, I think the second part of that question I've already implicitly answered. I mean, I do think that anybody who is in one of these roles, one of the most important things they do is develop their successors, and to invest in that and to invest time in that. And even if the institution doesn't have very well structured succession planning, that's something that a middle manager, a team leader of this kind, should always have in their mind. In terms of, should I be looking for a mentor? Yes, of course you should. Some of it is also about just taking advantage of the opportunities that are presented every day. I mean, having worked in a number of research institutes for a number of directors, there were some of them I thought did it well, and some of them I thought did it badly. And I tried to sit down to use my training as a sociologist, but I mean, I don't think it's, I don't think you have to be a sociologist to do it. You have to sit down and think about, what did X do well and what did Y do badly, and bear in mind that you can sometimes learn as much from working for a bad director or a bad manager as you can from working for a good one. I mean, you learn about the things not to do. You learn about how not to treat your team, and what gets the best out of them, and what demoralizes them, and leads them to want to go and work somewhere else, or perhaps just to sort of go through the motions in front of you. So I mean, some of it is just about taking advantage of those opportunities for learning. Some of it's about deliberately looking for opportunities to to share experiences with other people who are in that role. I think there's a kind of lateral mentoring as well. I mean, one of the things which I picked up from from some department chairs that I knew in the United States was the importance of going to big professional meetings for talent spotting purposes. And you walked around and you listened to the graduate students who were presenting, and if you heard somebody really smart, you might buy them a drink and tell them you had a job coming up and would they be interested in applying for it when it came. And I happened to be in a meeting a couple of years later with some people from some department chairs from STEM departments who were complaining that they never got people applying to be postdocs with them. The most prestigious postdoc funding schemes in science, very often an individual who's a smart PhD student will apply and it will be awarded to them in their own right, and then they get to choose which university to take it to. And I just talked about my own experience about going to conferences as a headhunter, and it clearly came as a complete revelation to my colleagues in the STEM departments that anybody would go to a major scientific meeting, and that as a full professor, etc., you'd make a point of going around looking for smart graduate students, trying to identify the next generation of talent, and trying to get them to think about, well, if I got one of these prestigious fellowships, actually I'd like to come and work in your lab rather than necessarily staying where I am or going anywhere else. And the idea that you might have to invest a little bit of time and energy in not drinking in the smart bars with your mates, but spending a little bit of time talking to the serfs was clearly a bit sort of jaw-dropping around the table on that particular occasion. And that I think it's the sort of sharing that again can be very important. And it's why for example, we suggest that the handbook might be used for sort of interdisciplinary workshops where you've got a group of actual or prospective middle managers from different backgrounds coming together, reading the same material, and then exploring its relevance to each of them, but also, if you like, sharing what they've brought to the workshop as well as what the book might have provoked. Michael.
So this is another question that you've somewhat implicitly answered in a couple different approaches, but I'm going to ask it a little more explicitly. It's like, how do you learn to be an entrepreneur, or how do you learn to be collaborative, or how do you learn some of you had a list of, I think, about 5 different skills that are really necessary. And if I'm not naturally there, what does it take to develop these things?
Well, I think the first part of it is recognizing that these are things that you might need to develop. I mean, some of it comes from the environments. I mean, some of it comes from recognizing. I mean, I think people are sort of more and less gifted as entrepreneurs, but I think some of it is recognizing, again, at a fairly early point in your career, that you may well have a better career if you don't try to go on revising your PhD for the next 40 years. I mean, the most successful research units, research institutes, leaders, I mean, are people who are constantly alert, who are constantly moving their groups into the areas where the leading edge of the science or scholarship is, and where the resources are available. there are fashions in funding. There are different agendas come through from different funders. You sometimes get an opportunity to influence that, but more often than not, you have to react to it. And that may well be, and that certainly is about, for example, encouraging people early in their career to see that what they got out of their PhD is a set of skills that they can deploy flexibly in response to where the opportunities are moving, rather than to think, well, I wrote this PhD about one particular topic. I wrote this PhD about this particular amino acid. I suppose I could write, a grant proposal to look at another amino acid, and sort of continuing along that sort of that fairly narrow track, rather than saying, well, actually, in the course of my PhD, I learned that I could do certain sorts of experiments, I could use certain sorts of equipment. I've acquired a repertoire of techniques. Okay, where do people want to give me money, to continue working, that I can use these techniques, and it's that kind of sort of lateral thinking that I think we're not necessarily very good at encouraging in our in people early in their careers. I mean, you might say that I was forced to develop it to an unusual degree simply because when you work in research institutes, typically you're very dependent on external grant funding. The contracts are for 2 years, 3 years. If the money doesn't keep coming in, then you don't get to eat. That's a pretty powerful stimulus to think a bit differently from somebody who gets tenure fairly early in their career and thinks they should just go on reproducing what they've always done for the rest of eternity. Michael?
I think we're pretty much down to what would have been our last question. I do have a real quick one if you can answer it really quickly. And it's like, how do I know if I'm doing well? In traditional academics, there's a set of metrics that we can use, but how do I, as a manager, do I know if I'm doing well?
Well, the nicest thing that I ever had said to me as an institute director was from an emeritus colleague who was affiliated with our group. And she once said to me, this is the first workplace I've come to where I walk down the corridor in the morning and everybody has a smile on their face.
Well, I hope our folks, I hope the people that have been listening to our webinar and the people that are going to listen to the archived version also have a smile on their face. It's all the time we have for today, and I want to thank you all, and especially I want to thank Robert Dingwall for joining us. In the coming weeks, expect those of you that are registered, and if you're online, you were registered, expect an email that includes a link to view the archive webinar and the slides, as well as answers to some of the questions that we did not get to today. And please stay connected with us on our blog, methodspace.com, for information on upcoming webinars. And one last shout out for the book that Robert was co-editor for. And if you look on the screen right now, you'll see the discount code UK16HDBKS. And that's a pretty hefty discount, so I encourage you to really consider buying this book. My hard sell. Thank you again, and we'll be back with another methods-based webinar in the future. Keep an eye on us. Thank you. Goodbye.